Hello everyone and welcome to Archaeoviking. The subject of today's video are two of my favorite regions to study for history and archaeology, and that is China and Mongolia. Specifically, how their parts that they played in the development of human civilization as we know it. Now, of course, civilization is a broad term uh, and doesn't always fit what a lot of people think. Um, but they were very key in developing the civilization of Eurasia and East Asia. So, uh, as the title says, China and Mongolia are often forgotten or overlooked cradles of civilization. So, what is a cradle of civilization? Well, oftentimes when you hear the term cradle of civilization, the most common thought is this area right here, uh, the Near East, or also known as the Fertile Crescent. Mainly talking about the Nile and the Egyptian civilization, as well as the Mesopotamian civilizations and the civilizations of the Levant around here in Israel and Jordan and Syria. While they certainly do deserve their time in the sun, uh, they weren't the only cradles of civilization by any stretch. Um, Oftentimes, in fact, there were multiples contemporary to them. The Indus Valley civilization, as well as the Peruvian and Mesoamerican civilizations, and of course, the civilizations of East Asia. Traditionally, East Asia is thought up as what you see here: Mongolia, China, Korea, Japan, and sometimes, depending on who you're talking to, Vietnam, due to how much influence China had on Vietnam, as well as how much influence China had on Korea, Mongolia, and Japan. So, this is not usually what you would think about uh, when it comes to the cradle of civilization. Usually you think about Sumeria, Uruk, Acadia, Babylon. But really, once you look at the history in archaeology, you see that a lot of the goalposts uh, were reached in East Asia earlier than the Fertile Crescent. So the first among these was actually during the Paleolithic era, which roughly, as you can see here, was like 125,000 to anywhere between 20 to 10,000 years ago, give or take. Obviously, none of the last couple of dates are on this map, but this gives you a general idea for what the Paleolithic looked like. And during this time, in China and also southern Siberia, we began to see the earliest forms of pottery. In fact, the earliest surviving pieces of pottery ever found were found in Jianrendong Cave in southern China. Here's a map of the cave right here uh, that you can sort of see. And these were the spots over here that they excavated. And once they found the pieces of pottery, they used radiometric dating, I believe thermoluminescent dating, uh, to determine that the pottery was at minimum 20,000 years old. So very old pottery. And of course, it had certain residues indicated that it was used for cooking. But it wasn't the only one of its kind. In fact, over here in this region of Siberia that with names that I'm not gonna attempt to pronounce out of respect, but you can see them here. They found similarly aged pottery. They're not quite as old, but still close enough. And they ran a variety of tests and were able to determine that pottery in Siberia and China was developed for several diverse reasons. Whether it be to store food, as you would expect, or to cook, or to brew rudimentary beer or other kind of alcoholic drinks, which are also strikingly old. But either way, it was used as a way to help conserve resources, which would make sense considering the type of environment that Siberia and China was at this time. And yes, anyone watching, this was the only region that had developed pottery at that point in time, 20,000 years ago, in the Paleolithic. Other regions had used ceramics, but they were used ceramics to carve statuettes and things like that. Pottery had not been developed here. Also, no, this does not mean that people from China went around the world and taught everyone how to make pottery. Sorry, ancient aliens and ancient civilizations people, that's not how that works. Pottery was just developed independently by civilizations and cultures across the world because humanity thinks alike. But this is the earliest evidence for pottery. Similarly, other technologies in the region were developed to also help conserve resources. And that was what is called microlithic technology, or using what are called microblades that you see right over here. And they were used all over the place in this region, and I'll show you the map of the distribution in a little bit. But essentially, microblades were broken off and attached to, in a variety of ways, to usually paddles, but also to sticks or, you know, twigs of some sort of like arrows, to be used on spears and atlatl darts during hunting. And the reason for this is for a couple of reasons. Now, one, it should be stated that these microblades actually take more time to make than simply breaking, you know, making a point sort of like this. Now, I should say that this is actually 2 microblades, not 1, but it does sort of look like an arrowhead. And so the arrowhead takes less time than the 2 microblades. However, if a microblade falls out or breaks off of this paddle right here, you know, any of these little paddles or breaks out between these 2 twigs, all you need to do is reattach it. And also, if only one breaks off, you've still got several here that you can use and cause just as much damage as a regular spear point or arrowhead. Well, actually, at this point, it would be atlatl darts, but still, or atlatl darts. Therefore, allowing you to conserve resources, because it takes time to go out and find cobbles of chert or flint. They're both the same thing. To break off into these blades, or to break off into any point. So any way you can conserve time and energy and resources in the inhospitable environment that Siberia and China were, and Mongolia were at the time, is a win. And you know, here's some other ways you could do that. And as this, you see this diagram, you know, organic material was strong, while stone was lethal. So what's the best way to utilize both of these advantages? Combine them. So you see here, inset microlithic technology, microblades, into organic technology is both strong and lethal. And again, if 1 or 2 of these falls off, you still got a viable weapon, versus if your spear point or atlatl dart point breaks. So the microblade technology was a very old technology and began to move into Asia during the Paleolithic, as you can see in this diagram, versus the non-blade technology that was used in the temperate zone, versus microblade technology being used in the frigid zone, which again makes sense. And it was used as a resource management tool in this inhospitable zone that you see right here, versus the more temperate and probably more resource abundant zones. And as you can see here, by all of these sites, it was a very widespread technology in Northeast Asia, Mongolia, Mongolia over here, China, Korea, Japan, everywhere. Which makes sense for, again, the time and era that it was. But actually, these tools would continue well into the Neolithic Age, right up until the onset of the Bronze Age or the Copper Age. And also, these tools can be found in indigenous assemblages across North and South America. I mean, look at Aztec technology with the Macahuatl. I'm sure I butchered that pronunciation. Sorry to any Nahuatl speakers. Putting the obsidian microblades in the paddle. And this is seen all over the Americas. Not really in Europe, but in the Americas and Asia, definitely. And that makes sense considering the indigenous Americans, the Paleo Indians, came over around 30,000 years ago into the Americas from this area. So very, very distantly, the indigenous peoples of America have these peoples to thank for the technology that was used so far and wide in the Americas. Now we go into one of the most common indicators of civilization, at least to a lot of people, agriculture. And again, we have some of the oldest agriculture domestication in China. Now, to be fair, these two that you see here, millet and rice, are actually sort of neck and neck with squash domestication in Peru and in the Andes in general, which may be slightly older, 11,000 years versus what these two will be, and I'll get that into that in a second. But the fact of the matter is, these two were still, if not the first domesticated crops in the world, were the second and third domesticated crops in the world. So millet takes either the ties with squash is the first or is the second. And right in this area in the Chishan Plateau, archaeological evidence in the early thousands was able to determine that millet domestication dates back to between 9,000 to 10,000 years ago, around 9,671 to 10,566 years ago, making it the first domesticated plant in all of Eurasia. Rice is very similar. Rice, archaeological evidence, archaeological work was conducted in the Heiwashan, the Shengshan, and the Hushi basin here, the Jinshu basin. And what they did is they essentially took rice phytoliths, small rice particles, and using them, they were able to date rice domestication, or at least the rice that they found so far, to between 7,500 years ago to 9,500 years ago. So not quite as old as millet, but very, very close, very neck and neck. It's also important to note millet was domesticated in North China and rice was domesticated in South China. And that makes sense considering the type of environments that rice grows in versus millet and wheat and such grows in. So they domesticated, China domesticated plants before anyone else in Eurasia, and only just slightly after cultures in the Andes. So, and they were actually the ones who were eventually responsible for the diffusion of rice and millet throughout Eurasia. Now we must go on to Mongolia. So Around 5,000 years ago, Mongolia began to see a dramatic cultural change. Cultural, I don't want to say revolution, but an explosion. And it was thanks to the Indo-European cultures that came out of the Pontic-Caspian steppe over here, called the Yamnaya. One of the earliest offshoots of the Yamnaya Indo-European culture was this culture over here called the Afanasievo. They were the second oldest culture to break off from the Yamnaya, right after the Proto-Hittites, who, this is just an estimate because we're not sure when exactly the Proto-Hittites broke off. That's a whole nother video. But, the long and short of it is essentially their language, while it's in Indo-European language, definitely. The Hittite language is much more archaic than the rest of these. So they may have broken off. They broke off a lot earlier in this 300 years, maybe, before Afanasievo, if not more. But either way, the Afanasievo were the second oldest culture to break off, and they migrated into Mongolia, or what is now modern day Mongolia, as well as Kazakhstan. And and here's their little range here between 3,000 to 3,500 BC, so about 5,000 years ago. Soon followed by the Indo-Nova culture. And with them, they brought chariots and horse domestication. Now, for a long time, it was not known exactly where horse domestication happened for sure. There were a couple of contenders. The Botai culture, named after the city of Botai in Kazakhstan, and then the Yamnaya culture in the Pontic-Caspian steppe. However, last year, a study conducted by, I believe it was like 150, I'm not sure, I didn't take the time to count all of them, but 150 different researchers across Eurasia, Spain, China, Russia, Mongolia, etc., were able to narrow it down to the Yamnaya culture, which makes sense considering that's who the Afanasievo broke off from. And so they brought chariots and horse domestication, which did not exist in the region until the arrival of the Yamnaya in circa 3,000, 3,500 BCE, with horseback riding eventually being developed out of chariot pulled horses in around 1,200 BCE. And you can see the exchange of chariots actually between China and the Afanasievo culture, or at least the eventual descendants of the Afanasievo. This is the Zhou dynasty area, and just shortly up here is Mongolia, and you can sort of see how easy it was to exchange the various different cultural aspects, such as chariot riding. And you do see this in Chinese burials, such as this chariot right here, as well as this depiction from a Chinese burial, roughly 1,200 BCE, right around here. The chariot, here's the rider, and the horses with the bits and such. But also, the Afanasievo culture brought with them the what are called amidst spiritual practices. I'll put it that way. They brought with them new spiritual practices that can be seen in these items called deer stones, which, as you can see in the picture and the name suggests, are megaliths that dot the Mongolian landscape that have deer on them. Also horses, and oftentimes, as you can see at the bottom here, depictions of weapons and such. And in some cases, such as this one right here, which I have actually seen, and it's amazing, so are all of them, this deer stone has a face in it. It may depict a warrior of some sort. And as I got to talk with one of the leading experts on deer stones, as far as I understand it, this deer stone is unique from the rest of them across Eurasia, because you do see them in other parts, not just Mongolia. Something that is connected with the deer stones actually is that was also new to the region: horse sacrifice. Horses were often sacrificed in religious aspects, though also, showing their importance as spiritual animals as well as domestic animals, and then buried under the deer stones, as you can see, or beside the deer stones, as you can see in this depiction right here. And often what it was is they would place the head of the horse along with the horse's hooves right by it, in a what's clearly a very spiritual practice, which makes sense considering how important the horse was to steppe cultures that were mostly derived from Indo-European cultures, but also eventually these separate Turkic cultures that and Proto-Mongolic cultures that were influenced by the Indo-Europeans. So while they weren't originally Indo-European, their cultures were influenced by them. So one could argue they were sort of successors to the Indo-Europeans while not actually being Indo-Europeans themselves. And you can, tell how they were killed even. You see the sort on the left, the, butcher marks right here, as well as over here, the puncture mark into the skull. So they're killed in a variety of ways before being buried by the deer stones, of which you can see right here, this excavator pulling up a horse head by this deer stone. So very common religious practice. Horse sacrifices are very widespread across Mongolia, and they are around the Bronze Age and late Neolithic Age. So now we will move into China itself. So around the same time that major city-states in Mesopotamia, such as Uruk and Babylon, were being founded, as well as cities in Egypt, such as Abydos and Hierapolis, as well as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa in the Indus Valley civilization. Several very widespread and often overlapping cultures, as this map shows, were beginning to develop. There was the Yangshao culture, the Longshan culture, the Lingzhu culture, etc. And often they are described as being Neolithic cultures, which is not wrong, but oftentimes that sort of relegates them to sort of a lesser status than the other so-called cradles of civilization, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley civilization, in much a similar way that the Mesoamerica and Andean civilizations are relegated, wrongfully so, to lesser status, though Mesoamerica in the past few decades has actually been on the rise as one of those cradles of civilization, leaving the Chinese cultures and the Andean cultures in the dust. However, this is wrong and should be corrected. And that's because these cultures were very, very advanced themselves and very complex, equally so to the Fertile Crescent and Indus Valley civilizations, as well as the Indian civilizations. And you can see more of their widespreadness right here. You've got the Hongshan culture up here, who we're going to talk about in just a minute. The Baijin, the Yangshao, etc., etc. But so, very, very large cultures. And it's actually the Hongshan culture that we have to thank for the earliest depictions of the Long, or the excuse me, or the East Asian dragon that you can see here carved in jade, as well as the so-called pig dragon amulet, also carved in jade. And these date to the Hongshan culture dates to around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. right along with, when Uruk was being founded. So, makes no sense to relegate them to that. As you can see, very beautifully carved images. And they were also responsible for very, amazing, what could be called religious carvings, and, elaborate pottery. You see this pottery right here, and how, despite it being broken, how skillfully made it would have been, as well as the painting on it and the artwork that was on it. And then we come over here, excuse me, to this figure. And when I found the picture of this figure, I will say I had to double check to make sure this was actually from China, which it is, and it is from the Hongshan culture. But what's interesting about this is it looks very similar to objects found at Etowah, dating to the Mississippian period. So, independently, in several thousand years before the Mississippian period, the Hongshan culture was making very similar objects, probably for different functions, but similar nonetheless. And this has been connected to early Chinese religion, possibly being a royal figure or a deity or what have you, or both, because oftentimes in East Asian religions, deities were often synonymous with the ruler. Then we have to come to a slightly younger but also contemporary culture, the Chamel culture, that was responsible for building this massive citadel that you see right here between 2300 BCE to 2000 BCE. And they dominated northwestern China right here, and actually weren't that far from the city we'll talk about shortly, early to, I'm sure I butchered that a little bit, right around here. And they are one of the earliest stone fortified sites in East Asia that you can see with this circle right here that talks about stone fortified sites. What's also very interesting about Chamel is they are also responsible for, or at least as far as we can tell, for the development of early Chinese religion and mythology. So these two objects over here may or may not be the earliest depiction of, an early depiction, not the earliest, but an early depiction of the Long, of the East Asian dragon. I mean, they could be fish also, but you see the scales and the head right here are very similar to this jade dragon that was found at the site early to, this thought to have been the capital of the Jia dynasty, a semi-mythical first dynasty of China. This only dates to around 1900 around 2100 BCE, give or take. This is from 2300 BCE, so it's a couple hundred years earlier. And so it shows that this idea and image was actually developed far earlier than previously thought. Which also makes sense, I mean, because it was also in the same, Chamel was also very nearby where the Hongshan culture was. Chamel was also responsible for very sophisticated carvings. As you can see here, these anthropomorphic faces. This one sort of looks like the, actually they both do, they sort of look like what was called the Dao figure, which was a mythical monster that had infinite hunger until eventually ate itself in China's religion, and was often depicted on bronze figurines in similar likeness. Also, Chamel has yielded very beautifully carved and forged jade, what could be called dagger axes or sort of halberds, as well as jade figurines. And there is also a lot of evidence for a very elaborate social structure at the time, which makes sense. You would need a leader or leaders with a lot of power to rein in enough people to build a fortress like this, or at least most of the time. Sometimes you could do it communally, but usually it required a leader or leaders. So right here we have a major city-state that is contemporary with things like Akkad and Babylon and other city-states in Egypt, as well as in the Indus Valley civilization. I mean, this city was built right around the time of the height of the Indus Valley civilization. Then we have a further south, Chamel being up here. Further south, we have the Lingzhu culture. The Lingzhu culture lived in a similarly large city with a wall that you see depicted right here, and had a very elaborate, as far as we can tell, aristocratic society that you see right here. And it was very large. You can sort of see how large it was based off of this map right here of the site itself, of the wall, and the area that was studied. But also you can see a better sort of description of how large it was in this Venn diagram, this diorama right here, where you see how large the city was here compared to the surrounding area and the rivers and such. So very large city or town, whatever you want to call it, with large walls that were probably built for defense. I mean, usually that's what walls were built for. Very common idea. I mean, they could have been built for a couple other things, like to help mitigate flooding, but considering the rivers running through it, it was probably built for defense. And this civilization was responsible for very elaborate religious carvings out of jade, such as this gorget you see right here, as well as this carving and these jade discs. Furthermore, we know that they held a large sway over South China due to their political and aristocratic nature. However, unfortunately, Lingzhu and Chamel would eventually decline for much the same reason: climate change. Massive flooding happened. No, not a global flood, people, but massive flooding of the rivers happened across South China. In fact, there's evidence of one city where landslide combined with flooding wiped it out. And then in Chamel's case, in North China, the climate changing actually caused the area to become more arid and therefore caused crops to not be able to grow as much, directly impacting its viability as an area to live. And in both cases, people likely migrated to different areas once these things began to happen. And it was due to the legacy of these large city-states that existed, which Lingzhu actually being older than Chamel, dating to around 5,000 years ago, 3,000 BCE, actually 3,300 BCE, in fact, that with the legacy of these cultures, a more concrete and probably more widespread kingdom, not empire, but kingdom, was probably able to be founded. That is the semi-mythical Jia dynasty, the so-called first dynasty of China that the Shang probably overthrew in 1600 BCE. And for the longest time, it was believed that the Jia dynasty was completely mythical. However, this changed with the discovery of the site of Erlitou, which is this site right here. And through archaeological work, it was determined that it had quite a lot of influence over the region you see here. You can see all the dots of influence, as well as these circles right here showing further influence. And much like Chamel and Lingzhu before it, it had an elaborate aristocratic society and held large sway over over the surrounding area, and probably held more sway over its surrounding area than Lingzhu and Chamel did, though Chamel and Lingzhu were definitely, as well as other city-states, were definitely the origin of Chinese culture in the Hongshan. And at Erlitou, we found a couple of indicators of the development of Chinese civilization as we know it, seen in like the Shou dynasty and the Han dynasty and such as the development of rudimentary writing that you see here that had been found at Erlitou, which had not been found at Chamel or Lingzhu, which doesn't necessarily mean anything. Not every civilization had writing in the form that we think of like this, but this does show that they were beginning to use writing, because the use of writing helps you communicate better at farther distances. Erlitou culture was also, in very similar ways, again, maybe inherited some of it from them, at forming jade objects, such as this jade inlaid plaque right here, as well as the use of bronze. They were a Bronze Age culture, something again that Chamel and Lingzhu weren't quite yet. They did have some bronze objects, but they weren't quite there. But that doesn't change anything. It just shows that this was the next stage in China's development as a culture, by developing bronze. Other bronze objects found include axes, bronze pots, as well as the aforementioned dagger axes, or the predecessor to halberds, as well as arrows, bronze arrows, and then of course the aforementioned jade dragon. So you can see right here all the things that were found at Hongshan, at Chamel, at Lingzhu, all sort of seem to coalesce in one form or the other, whether it be indirectly as the Lingzhu connection probably was, considering how far south Lingzhu was, or directly as Chamel and Hongshan probably were, into this culture called the Erlitou culture, forming the first so-called Chinese kingdom. Though it wasn't called China at the time, that wouldn't be till after the Qin dynasty, which I do plan to do a video on. But this was the beginning of the synthesis of all these different city-states in Neolithic and Bronze Age China. And eventually, the legacy of all of these, Chamel, Lingzhu, Hongshan, Erlitou, Mongolia, would develop into the Shang dynasty, which is a subject I will cover in another video. But without these cultures that I mentioned, without the development of horse domestication and chariots that was brought in by the Afanasievo culture, as well as metallurgy, that's something I forgot to mention. The Afanasievo culture is thought to have been the culture that brought metallurgy into East Asia. Without the complex city-states that were developed in Chamel and Lingzhu and other places in the Hongshan culture, Erlitou would not have been able to be formed to create the first proto-state, and then without that first proto-state, the Shang dynasty wouldn't have been able to be found. And then without the Shang Dynasty, East Asia would not exist. So China and Mongolia definitely were cradles of civilization. I mean, especially considering especially considering Lingzhu and Chamel were contemporary with the city-states of Uruk, Akkad, and Abydos and such, and had populations that were just as many, if not larger. So cities did not develop first in the Fertile Crescent. They developed, actually, one could argue, first in China, but at minimum, independently and contemporarily in China with the other Fertile Crescents. So with that, I'm going to leave you. Did you learn about any of this in school at one point, whether it be K through 12 or college? Do you have any other subjects in this video or outside of this video you want me to cover? Because if so, just let me know in the comments. And with that, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and I hope you all have a good day.